Hello, my dear friends. Tonight, we're going to unveil mysteries that once seemed supernatural, enigmas that lingered for hundreds of years in the Middle Ages, only to be decoded in just the last few years, thanks to DNA, archaeology, and modern technology. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss any story from medieval dreams. And don't forget to tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, so I'll know I always have a companion on this journey. Now then, turn off the lights, curl up under a warm blanket, and let us ease ourselves into tonight's voyage together. In the darkness of a medieval monastery, where thick stone walls were built to preserve sanctity and shut out the world beyond, it is sometimes what lies buried beneath the floor that tells the truest story. The tale of the infant remains found inside the tomb of a nun is one of those mysteries, gentle, chilling, and revealing the quiet contradictions that the age so often tried to hide beneath a cloak of morality. When archaeologists opened that tomb, they expected to find an ordinary nun, a woman who had devoted her entire life to God, living in silence, prayer, and discipline. But instead of sacred tranquility, they uncovered something entirely different: the tiny skeleton of a newborn child placed right beside the woman's body. No record from the 13th century ever states that nuns were permitted to bear children, nor is there any mention of infants being buried in their graves. So for years the story became the subject of rumours, a miracle, a cursed child, a secret ritual, or, what no one dared say aloud, a deliberately concealed sin. Only when modern science intervened did the mystery unravel. DNA analysis revealed what medieval clerics would never have admitted. The child was the nun's biological offspring, not an abandoned baby, not the result of a foundling, but living proof of a truth that had been smothered for centuries. And that truth opened a new door. Monasteries, it turned out, were not always fortresses of perfect purity. Human beings, even when hiding behind stone walls and prayers, still carried with them instinct, loneliness, the need for affection, and sometimes despair. The nun may have loved someone, or been coerced, or been taken advantage of by those who are supposed to embody virtue and compassion. No one can ever know, but one thing is certain: once the child was born, the system had no place for its existence. Many medieval monasteries operated under an unspoken principle: what brought shame must be hidden, not resolved. And the means of concealment were sometimes so cold that they make the modern mind shudder. The child, instead of being allowed to live, became a material sin that had to disappear. The nun, in her final moments, may have begged to have her baby buried beside her, a last fragment of motherhood in a life crushed by discipline. This small story reflects the vast fractures of that era, the conflict between who people truly were and who they were expected to be, between natural longing and religious law, between love and sin, and the most haunting, the most beautiful, and the saddest truth of all. The truth eventually rose to the surface, even if it took 700 years. That tiny skeleton became testimony that no wall, no prayer, no ritual can bury completely what people try to conceal. Not forever. In the darkness of the medieval monastery, that truth sits quietly, patiently, and unmistakably, like the soft sigh of time itself. In a 14th century Polish cemetery, where winter winds whistled through jagged stone markers, archaeologists once uncovered graves that could chill even the modern observer. The dead were buried with a razor-sharp sickle placed across their throat, sometimes at the mouth, sometimes across the abdomen, as if the community feared that with even the slightest mistake, the person beneath the earth would rise, grope through the fog, and return to do something terribly wrong. When the graves were first discovered, the media called them vampire burials, and it was hard to blame them. The medieval atmosphere was already thick with superstition, and a few oddly arranged skeletons were eager to spark a legend. But the truth, as usual, did not arrive with a scream. It arrived with the whisper of science. When the remains were examined, researchers found something remarkable. These supposed vampires showed no signs of struggle, no indications that they'd been killed in panic, no scratches or wounds hinting that they had ever attacked anyone. Instead, they shared another trait entirely: deformed bones, protruding jaws, bowed legs, and slightly misshapen skulls, the classic signs of severe vitamin D deficiency and rickets. And that was the clue that unlocked the entire story. In 14th century rural Eastern Europe, where winters were long and sunlight was a luxury, rickets was far from rare. But the problem was that people at the time did not know it was a disease. All they knew was that certain individuals looked not like normal people. Their bodies twisted, their gait strange, their faces asymmetrical, their teeth misaligned. They stood crooked, walked unsteadily, and from a distance could resemble something not quite human. And because the Middle Ages lacked science but overflowed with imagination, the simplest explanation was vampire. Not the handsome, moonlit, seductive Hollywood kind. Not a charming nocturnal blood drinker, but a neighbour with a bone disorder. Try telling that to a 14th century farmer, though. They would stare at you as if you had just declared that wind wasn't real. So when someone with an unusual appearance died, fear overwhelmed reason. They had to ensure that death was a full stop, not a comma. A sickle was placed across the neck so that if the deceased tried to rise, the blade would sever the throat, or at least injure them enough to keep them still. Other metal objects were used as well. Iron stakes, heavy stones, even chains. All of it to answer one question: what if they came back? Today, when we look at these graves, we no longer see monsters. We see a poor, uneducated society, but one whose fears were painfully real. They had no textbooks, no doctors, no x-rays. They had only long nights, mysterious deaths, and helplessness. The most beautiful and saddest thing about these graves is that they are not stories about vampires at all, but stories about people, about how fear grows in the absence of knowledge, about how a different body can become a horror tale, about how a community tries to protect itself by any means available, even methods we now view as cruel. These vampire burials of Poland, once decoded, became a perfect testament to a truth of the medieval world. People of the past did not fear death. They feared what they could not explain. And sometimes a single beam of science is enough to banish an entire century of darkness. In the tales told around Irish hearths in the 13th century, where the Atlantic winds howled like an ancient spirit and green fields stretched to the horizon, people spoke of giants who once walked their land. Everyone knew some version of the story. A warrior taller than any standing stone felled in a bloody battle, or an unusually long skeleton accidentally unearthed by a plough, or a skull so large that a child could crawl inside it. These tales were never short of grandeur or terror, as if the storytellers were trying to invent medieval titans long before the world knew Homer or cinema. Then, centuries later, as modern archaeology peeled back layers of soil, these giants began to reappear, not in firelight but in the glow of laboratory lamps. Some discovered skeletons did indeed seem unusually tall, genuinely exceeding the average height of medieval Europeans, who typically stood only around 1.60 to 1.70 meters, It is no wonder villagers once saw them and instantly concluded not ordinary humans. But the story grew even more intriguing when researchers examined the bones closely. The human femur turned out to be curved in a way no human thigh bone could ever bend. The human shoulder joint was broad and flattened in a manner incompatible with human anatomy, and the supposedly giant skull had small horns, something Homo sapiens was never designed to possess. The truth finally emerged gently, and with a hint of humour. The remains were horse bones, cattle bones, or sometimes a mixture of both, displaced by soil movement, flooding, or the simple passage of time. What did this mean? It meant that many giants slain in battle were, in reality, exhausted war horses collapsing on the field. One of the most famous giant skeletons, once put on display as proof of medieval giants, turned out to belong to a particularly large and healthy cow. The mistake was understandable. In a world where most people were illiterate, had never seen a dissected human body, and lived within a landscape steeped in Celtic beliefs, the legend of Fionn mac Cumhaill and poems about giants building sea walls, any large bone naturally became living evidence. And so, for centuries, villagers spoke of warriors as tall as oaks, falling to the ground so heavily that they left deep pits from the impact of their bodies. No one suspected it was merely the burial hollow of a winter-fat cow. Modern science decoded this myth not with mockery but with a certain tenderness, because behind the mistake lay an entire world of imagination. People living through war, famine and fog, still searching in tangled bones for a story to tell, for a reason to believe they were not small in a vast and indifferent world. The issue wasn't that they were wrong. The issue was that they wanted to believe that their ancestors were giants, believe that their land had once been guarded by superhuman warriors, believe that this harsh, uneven world still held room for the extraordinary. Today, when we revisit these tales, it is easy to laugh, but if we pause, we see something deeply human, that people, from the Middle Ages to the modern day, have always explained the world first through imagination, long before science arrived, that sometimes the truth does not kill the myth. It simply makes the myth more beautiful, because we understand why it was created. The Irish giants were not human at all, but they remain part of cultural memory, a testament to humanity's desire to draw stories larger than itself, in order to face a life that is too fragile, too real, and too small. In a small church in Bavaria, where stone walls have stood since the days when people believed more in miracles than in medicine, there exists a whispering tale that has lingered for centuries. The two-faced skull, a relic once regarded as proof of a curse, a monster, or a child unacknowledged by God. Pilgrims once stood silently before this skull under the flickering glow of candles, imagining all the horrors medieval fear could conjure. A child born with two faces, one person, yet appearing as though two souls were trapped in a single body. For in a world where religious darkness mingled with primal fear, anything unusual was easily cast as a sign of the demonic. Yet the truth, like every medieval mystery, when unwrapped by modern science, turned out to be both simple and heartbreakingly human, more likely to make one sigh than shudder. Archaeologists had found the skull in the grave of an infant, buried with full ritual, a striking detail since no child deemed a demonic deformity would ever be granted such treatment. This was the first surprise. If this was a monster, why was it buried like any other Christian? The answer only emerged when the skull underwent CT scanning, where the machine's light pierced bone layer by layer, revealing what medieval observers could never understand. But modern ones can. It was not a monster at all, but a pair of conjoined twins. Not two faces of a twisted soul, but two children whose lives never reached completion. An extremely rare congenital condition, perhaps one case in 100,000, had caused the two fetuses to develop with fused cranial structures, their faces appearing joined in a way no medieval person possessed the language to describe. And so they called it something not of this world. Today's technology makes it possible to see the seam between the two sets of bones, the way the brain lobes overlapped, and the anatomical details that science can easily explain, but medieval faith could not. The skull does not speak of demons. It speaks of biology, the fragility of life, and a tragedy that began the moment existence itself tried to form. What makes the story even more human is this. The child, or rather the two children, were buried with Christian rites. Someone, perhaps a grieving mother or the church's caretaker, decided they deserved rest as true human beings. They were not burned, not thrown into a river, not condemned as devilish deformities as so many infants were in that era. And from that choice, we glimpse something important, that even in an age steeped in superstition and fear, there were still hearts that chose compassion over judgment. Yet the legend lived its own life. For centuries, the skull was retold as the remnant of a two-faced child, a babe punished by God, or an omen upon the village. People came to see it as a forbidden symbol, part terror, part curiosity, part belief that their world was full of supernatural interventions. Only when science stepped in was the tale finally restored to truth. Not a curse, not a monster, but a painful congenital anomaly. A reminder of the delicate and precarious nature of human life. And when we piece the story together, we see the soft, quiet lesson hidden beneath centuries of dust. That many mysteries of the medieval world were not magic at all, but human sorrows without a name. That rather than faulting them for superstition, we can understand. They did the only thing they could in a world without CT scans, without anatomy, without science to chase away the dark. And that sometimes the frightening thing was never the two-faced creature, but the way humans feared what they could not comprehend. A tiny skull, lying silent for centuries, has told us that story. Gently, truthfully, and profoundly human. Across many ancient castles in Europe, when archaeologists began dismantling layers of stone walls for restoration, they uncovered a strange and recurring phenomenon, so frequent that it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Children's shoes, small, worn, sometimes heavily damaged, hidden deep within brickwork, beams, door frames, and even chimneys. They were not mixed with rubbish, not accompanied by clothing or toys, but placed deliberately in specific positions, hidden in architectural weak points, doorways, windows, rooftops, northeast walls. Immediately the first hypothesis arose. Could this be an accident? Some kind of medieval construction waste? But the number of shoes was far too large. Thousands found across Europe, from England, Germany and the Netherlands to the Czech lands, and all located in cavities impossible to fall into by chance. This indicated one thing. It was a purposeful act sustained across centuries, and even more striking, the majority of them were children's shoes. Small shoes, rounded toes, soles worn down on one side. The unmistakable signs of having been genuinely used by a child before being placed into the wall. As historians and ethnographers began comparing findings across regions, an answer slowly emerged. Those shoes were not meant for the living. They were protective charms against witches. From the 14th to the 18th century, belief in witchcraft spread across Europe. Particularly in rural areas and small towns, people believed that witches could not enter a house if human traces, especially those of children, blocked the entrance. A child was viewed as a symbol of purity, of a life not yet touched by the devil. The scent and warmth of a child they believed repelled evil spirits. A shoe, an object in direct contact with the body, was thought to carry the strongest human imprint. Thus it became the perfect protective amulet, inexpensive, effective according to folk belief, and easy to hide in the strategic points of a home. In several 16th century documents, people mention the practice of shoe concealment as part of construction rituals. When building a new house, the owner would secretly hide an old child's shoe in the wall to ward off evil, much like how some families today hang protective charms. But unlike modern symbolic objects, this was a charm that literally carried the traces of a real person. An intriguing detail: children's shoes were chosen more often than the adult shoes. Anthropologists explain this with two reasons. One, religious and superstitious belief. Children were seen as sinless, uncorrupted by original sin, and therefore possessing stronger protective power. 2. Symbolic value. In many cultures, children represent the future, continuity. Placing a child's shoe within a wall was akin to giving the house a new life. There was also a practical point. Children's shoes were simply easier to hide. When archaeological science came into play, researchers used organic dating techniques and analysis of leather and fibres, confirming that these shoes dated from the medieval period all the way to the Industrial Revolution, meaning that even as Europe developed universities, telescopes, and Enlightenment philosophers, people were still quietly tucking shoes into their walls. Sometimes, a single castle would yield as many as 50 shoes. Undeniable proof that this was not an isolated quirk, but a long-standing cultural system. A single wall might contain traces of 3 or 4 successive generations, each adding a new shoe during renovations. Looking back, the mystery of children's shoes lacks the supernatural spectacle of vampire graves or two-faced monsters, but it reflects something profoundly human. That in a world full of uncertainty, people will use whatever they have at hand to create a sense of safety, even an old child's shoe, and that truth is not strange at all. It shows that in the medieval era, amid war, plague, and invisible fears, people relied not only on swords, crosses, or prayers, but also on the small remnants of everyday life to protect themselves. Those shoes, lying silently in the walls for hundreds of years, bear witness to a simple fact. Human beings are the same in every age. Everyone wants to protect their home. Everyone wants to push away fear using the things most familiar to them. And sometimes history is not written in battles or legends, but in a tiny shoe a child lost long ago. When archaeologists opened a burial pit in York in the early 2000s, they believed they had uncovered something familiar: a Viking warrior. A tall skeleton, broad shoulders, battle marks etched into the clavicle and ribs, golden hair preserved in part by the unique soil conditions. Everything matched the image of a 9th century Norse invader. York, during the era of the Danelaw, was a centre of Viking power, so the initial conclusion seemed unquestionable. But what happened next turned this set of remains into one of the most bewildering cases of decoding history in modern British archaeology. When the team began analysing strontium and oxygen isotopes in the teeth, a method used to determine where a person grew up, they found a result utterly contrary to expectations. This man had not been born in Scandinavia, not in Norway, not in Denmark, not in Iceland. The isotopes pointed somewhere much closer. Northern England, perhaps less than 100 kilometres from York itself. This raised a far more troubling question. Why was a native Englishman buried in the manner of a Viking, with grave goods, prescribed body placement, and even a Viking hairstyle? The key lay in a factor that modern archaeology has only recently begun to study closely: the process of coerced cultural assimilation under the Danelaw. In the 9th century, when Viking rule dominated much of eastern and northern England, they did not merely seize land or levy taxes. They imposed culture, clothing, weaponry, funerary rituals, even diet. Native people, especially men of working age, were often forced into labour, compelled to fight alongside Viking forces, or required to conform to the new social norms. Analysis of the gold-haired warrior's bones revealed a dramatic dietary shift in his teenage years. From a low-protein diet to one rich in meat, fish, and dairy. The signature diet of Norse warriors. This suggests he did not willingly adopt Viking ways. He was made to live like them, eat like them, and perhaps fight for them. Even his blonde hair, once hailed as proof of Viking blood, was misleading. Pigment testing showed his natural colour had been light brown. The straw gold shade visible today is simply the result of time and chemical reactions in the soil. The picture now became far clearer. This was not a Viking invader, but an Englishman who had lived under Viking control and who had been forced to become part of their system. The injuries on his bones, many unhealed, suggest he died violently, perhaps while serving as a soldier for the Vikings, or during a revolt against them. Either scenario shows that he was more a victim of his age than a symbol of its glory. His Viking-style burial could reflect two possibilities. 1. He had become so fully assimilated that the Viking community regarded him as one of their own. 2. He was buried according to Viking rites because local people feared spiritual repercussions if they did otherwise, choosing the ritual of the conquerors to avoid misfortune. Whichever the truth, his grave remains crucial evidence of cultural imposition, something rarely described directly in medieval texts. The fascination of the York blonde warrior does not lie in drama or mystery, but in how he forces us to reconsider the Viking age from a seldom discussed angle. We're accustomed to seeing Vikings as powerful, confident, overwhelming, but archaeology reveals a far more complex world. Native men drawn into the machinery of war, young people turned into reluctant warriors, and funerary rituals becoming evidence of both coercion and adaptation. In the end, the blonde warrior is not a riddle about Viking ancestry at all. He's the face of a local culture forced to live under the shadow of foreign rule. And sometimes, history is not shaped by the conquerors, but by those who lived between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. In the year 1323, Paris, the intellectual heart of medieval Europe, witnessed one of the strangest events ever recorded. The demon-haunted nights of the Hôtel Dieu hospital, a place meant for the poor, the sick, the dying. Yet for several months no one dared approach it after dark. For once the sun had set, screams began to rise through the stone walls so violently that the night monks wrote, "The devils have taken this house of healing." But the sounds they described were not merely the groans of suffering. They were howls, wild laughter, the thud of skulls striking walls, the clicking of bones, murmured fragments of nonsense in no language anyone recognized. In an age when medical knowledge was painfully limited, anything that exceeded understanding was swiftly branded as supernatural, and so demonic possession became the most convenient explanation. The church organized prayers. Monks carried crosses into the wards. Holy water was sprinkled over every bed. But strangely, the cries continued untouched, as though nothing sacred had ever entered the room. To Parisians of the 14th century, especially those living near the hospital, Hôtel Dieu became a place of impurity. Rumours spread that anyone who listened to the devil's screams for too long might themselves become infected with madness. Nearly 700 years later, medical historians revisited the old records, and what they uncovered was not the work of demons, but a social and medical tragedy. The hospital's original notes reveal that most of the people screaming through the night were not the wounded or the plague-stricken, but individuals suffering severe mental disorders, schizophrenia, delusions, psychotic depression. Others were epileptic, their seizures accompanied by unconscious shouting, gnashing teeth, and violent convulsions. In that age, epilepsy was not a disease. It was the mark of a demon entering the flesh. Worse still, medieval hospitals were catastrophically overcrowded. At Hôtel Dieu, 2 or 3 patients often shared a single bed. One person crying out in the night was enough to startle the entire room, triggering waves of panic in others whose minds were already fragile. The chaos spread not through the supernatural but through collective fear, and medieval medicine had no answers, no sedatives, no psychiatry, no concept of neurological disorders. All that people had were prayers, restraints, and fear. When researchers pieced these factors together, an overburdened hospital, mentally ill patients, undiagnosed epilepsy, and the monk's own superstition, they reached a clear conclusion. The so-called demonic possession of the Paris hospital was nothing more than a psychological and medical crisis interpreted as the supernatural. What seemed, for centuries, to be one of the greatest hauntings of the 14th century turned out to reveal something far less mystical and far more heartbreaking. The sick were not understood, not treated, and not regarded as fully human. And it reminds us of a truth about medieval society. When science falls silent, fear speaks in its place. Within the stone walls of the Hôtel Dieu in 1323, the echoes were not demons rising from hell. They were the cries of people who never had the words to explain their pain. A mystery solved, and yet it leaves behind a lesson painfully modern. When humans do not understand something, they're quick to hand it over to the darkness, rather than seek the light. For more than 6 centuries, the Voynich manuscript has hovered on the threshold between scholarship and legend, like a stubborn shadow refusing to reveal its face. People have called it the cursed book, the witch's relic, even the cipher of an otherworldly civilization. And when you look at those pale yellow pages, the script belonging to no known writing system, the naked women bathing in green liquid, the distorted plants found nowhere in nature, you begin to understand why medieval minds believed it was not made by human hands. It feels like a locked door, waiting for a mind persistent enough to open it. For centuries, from alchemists to Renaissance spies, from English secret agents to modern scholars, no one could read even a single sentence. And because no one could read it, humans did what they so often did in the Middle Ages. They called it magic. The less they understood, the more they feared. The more they feared, the more fantastical the legends became. Some even believed that reading it aloud might be enough to summon catastrophe. Yet the turning point arrived in the 21st century, brought not by sorcery, but by something medieval people would almost certainly have called dark magic, artificial intelligence. A technology they could never have imagined became the key that peeled away half a millennium of enchantment. Researchers exposed AI to thousands of ancient texts, modelling hidden grammar, comparing character structures, and slowly the machine began to uncover patterns. The symbols that once looked like nonsense obeyed the rules of natural language. The bewildering illustrations were not occult sigils but crude botanical sketches, and after years of computation, most of the manuscript revealed itself. The Voynich book was not a demonic cipher at all, but a herbal compendium focused on women's health, written in a private coded system designed to conceal knowledge at a time when anything related to the female body could easily be condemned as witchcraft. In other words, what medieval society feared most was knowledge they did not dare speak aloud. The story is fascinating not merely because a mystery was solved, but because it exposes an ancient pattern. Humanity often invokes magic to disguise its own ignorance. We imagine demons, curses, and supernatural creatures simply because we lack the tools to understand. But when science finally catches up to that imagination, the darkness evaporates so quickly that we cannot help but smile at the fears of our ancestors. And yet, the Voynich manuscript has kept one thing: the allure of the unknown. Even with AI stripping away much of its mystique, several pages remain undecipherable, as though the book wishes to keep a small corner of secrecy for itself, like every ancient object that has survived the long corridor of centuries. That is why it continues to captivate us, not because it is cursed, but because it reveals something profoundly human. No matter the era we live in, we're always drawn to what lies just beyond our understanding. In the end, the truly frightening thing is not magic, but the fact that we do not yet know enough to call it by another name. Amid the windswept hills of Northumberland, where dry stone walls crumble like old bones and wild grass blankets forgotten paths, there lies a village that once existed, once filled with the cries of children, the ring of hammer on anvil, the murmur of prayers drifting through the morning mist. And yet, by the 14th century it had vanished completely. No traces, no mass graves, no uprising, no official record, only a few earth mounds left to the northern wind and the imagination of those who came after. Medieval people, with their instinct to prefer shadows over truth, immediately called it a curse. The village forgot God, God forgot the village, or a demon had taken the woods, or a witch had poisoned the well. A community disappearing without leaving a story. To them, that could only be supernatural. But modern archaeologists with geological mapping, pollen analysis and radiocarbon dating patiently pieced together fragments of reality. And what emerged was the opposite of those chilling tales whispered through generations. The village was not cursed. It simply died out, just as much of rural Europe withered during the dark century of plague and poverty. Archaeological evidence shows a clear population decline during the Black Death's sweep through England. Not everyone died at once. Rather, it was a slow cascade of losses, a household losing its father one year, the child the next, then the mother left with no one to work the fields. Graves scattered sparsely, grass swallowing doorways. Some survivors abandoned the place, not in fear of demons, but because no one was left to harvest, because winter lasted longer than the food supply, because the larger towns to the south offered a job, a roof, or at least a meal. Economic migration, a very modern concept, turns out to be the most accurate missing piece. The village wasn't swallowed. It was left behind little by little, like a lamp running out of the oil, extinguishing itself with no single culprit. Families still strong enough to travel sought better prospects. The frailer ones died, not from curses, but from the misfortunes of the age: plague, hunger, nearby conflict, rising taxes, and land that could no longer sustain them. Within a few decades, a once busy settlement became a scatter of stones, and then even those stones broke under centuries of rain and snow. What's interesting is that the disappearance itself created a new sort of legend. Humans struggle to accept ordinary endings. The village wasn't attacked by fiends, yet it became haunted by the imagination of its descendants. The slow, quiet fading brought by poverty and survival seems to unsettle us more than any ghost story. After all, one can fight demons, perform exorcisms, pray, even light fires to push back the dark. But how do you fight hunger? How do you defeat plague without medicine? How do you save a village when the land can no longer sustain its inhabitants? And that is what makes this mystery so profound. Sometimes the supernatural is merely a veil drawn over very real fears. The fear of losing home, family, and the fear of disappearing from the map with no name left behind. The Northumberland village was not punished by divine wrath. It was abandoned by history. And when we look down at those grass-covered ruins, perhaps the most frightening thing is not demons at all, but the fragile fate of a community at the mercy of forces far beyond its control, across the windswept grasslands of Eastern Europe, where horse bones crumble into the soil and ancient burial mounds sit like low, muted notes in a vast landscape. Archaeologists uncovered something that made the academic world straighten its spine. The armoured warriors, long assumed by medieval historians to be men, turned out to carry XX chromosomes. Skeletons buried with bows, spears, arrowheads, these stress marks of battle-hardened riders, all belong to women. And this truth, though revealed by modern DNA sequencing, seems to have been waiting for us for 1,000 years, silent but unshaken. For centuries, tales of female warriors, the so-called Amazons who rode horses, loosed arrows at full gallop and charged into enemy ranks like a storm of iron, were dismissed as poetic invention, a romanticised fantasy, a metaphor stretched too far. Yet these women appear again and again in Byzantine records, in Slavic folklore, even in Persian chronicles. Still, for hundreds of years, whenever a skeleton in armour was excavated, whenever a warrior's grave surfaced, archaeologists wrote the same line in their reports: male warrior. No testing, no hesitation. Weapons belonged to men. That was the unexamined truth of the Middle Ages and of much of the modern world. Everything shifted when researchers finally decided to do what their predecessors never considered: test for biological sex. What followed resembled the opening of an old chest, one confirmed female warrior after another, so many that even the most conservative scholars could no longer dismiss them. One skeleton with bowed legs, the signature of a lifelong rider. Another with an overdeveloped right shoulder, the unmistakable mark of an archer. A skull bearing the healed scar of a battle axe. A cuirass crafted in a size smaller than mail armour, but forged with the same martial care. All sharing the same undeniable fact: they were not men, and this was no anomaly. From southern Ukraine, once the homeland of the Scythians, to the distant Ural frontier, the pattern held. Women fought beside men, and at times formed the backbone of mounted raiding forces. This forces us to redraw our understanding of medieval gender. Not everywhere were women bound to kitchens, convents, or childbirth beds. On the steppe, where life was shaped by war, migration, and survival, the decisive qualities were not gender, but strength, agility, and courage. What's striking is that the Greek legend of the Amazons may not have been pure myth. The Greeks traded and fought with northern nomads. Stories of female riders who held their own in battle likely travelled mouth to mouth, embellished and mythologized, but with a core of truth that never disappeared. When modern science brushed away the soil, what remained confirmed that the ancients may have exaggerated, but they did not lie. What makes this story resonate in our quiet, sleepy historical tone is not the shock value, but the humanity beneath the armour. In the fractures of bone, you see an entire life lived in conflict. Among the grave goods, small mirrors, wooden combs, ornate saddle fittings, you glimpse daughters, mothers, lovers, real people carrying hopes and burdens not so different from ours. And perhaps the most surprising part is not that women once rode into battle, but that the world spent so long refusing to believe it. The Amazon warriors of Eastern Europe remind us that history is not always written correctly the first time. Sometimes the truth lies sleeping underground, waiting for a world finally willing to listen. When we look back at the medieval mysteries that modern science has gradually unravelled, we do not simply see the triumph of knowledge. We realise something far more profound. The stories once thought to be supernatural, demonic, or beyond explanation, in fact reflect the fears, beliefs, and ways people of that age tried to understand the world with the very limited knowledge they possessed. This does not make them naive compared to us. It simply makes them deeply human. For centuries, monks hid illegitimate infants in monastery walls. Polish peasants placed sickles across the mouths of the dead for fear of vampires. Villagers in Ireland mistook animal bones for those of giants. Bavarians spun curses around a two-faced skull. All these myths took shape because, in a dark world where death lurked close and nameless illnesses seeped into every home, people had to fill the space between fear and ignorance with stories, to explain, to comfort themselves, or simply to keep going. But then science arrived. Archaeology peeled back layers of soil, shining light onto skeletons once seen as proof of monsters. DNA revealed the identities of infants hastily buried behind monastery walls. Isotope analysis uncovered the journey of a warrior who was not a Viking. CT scans stripped curses from deformed remains, restoring truth to those once treated as omens. And each time, instead of draining the world of mystery, science opened the door to stories, even more moving. Because once the magical fog is lifted, what remains is always human. A nun who broke her vows for love. A sick child buried as a vampire simply because their body looked different. A community that vanished because of plague, not a curse. Tiny children's shoes hidden inside walls. Heartbreaking prayers from parents desperate to protect their little ones from invisible forces. These stories, though no longer supernatural, contain everything the Middle Ages truly were. Hardship, fierce faith, fragile hope, and countless nameless fears. What moves us is not demons, but the vulnerability of people facing the dark. And when science solves these mysteries, the lesson is never our ancestors were wrong, but rather our ancestors tried their very best to understand life with what little they had. In the end, as medieval mysteries fade beneath the light of knowledge, we realise that what endures is not curses or legends, but the human longing to make sense of the world. And that is what makes history beautiful. It shows us that in any age, whether in daylight or in darkness, people will always search for truth, even if they must wander very far to find it. And you? Do you believe those old legends were real? Leave a comment below before drifting off to sleep. Good night.